to Carlos Buesa, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Oryzon, or if you're in Spain, or Oryzon, if you're in the rest of the world. It seems to have some different pronunciations. Welcome. It's very good to have you here. So tell me a bit about your company, because it's based on something which will not be familiar to people, which is epigenetics. Just start off by telling us what epigenetics is.
Yeah, very glad to. I mean, epigenetics is a set of mechanisms by which our cells, our organisms, basically control the controller. So we have been told when we were to school that basically the mechanism by which our cells control the daily working are the genes, and genes are packing chromosomes. So cells and the organisms need to know how to arrange, how to orchestrate in every single moment of every single day of our life, how these cells communicate with the other, how the organisms communicate with the outer world to compensate, to adapt, to optimize the working of these genes, the working of these chromosomes. So epigenetics is basically, at the end of the day, a mix of different mechanisms by which our cells control how chromosomes are being activated and deactivated in specific small regions, local regions. And by doing so, the genes which are based on those regions are being activated or deactivated to optimize the functioning of the cell, compared or in harmony with the rest of the cells, or towards the changing conditions of the outer world.
So I guess it's a bit like, you know, having post-it notes in a recipe book, and the post-it notes are put there by the life that you live. It doesn't change the recipe, but what it does is it says, I want more of this recipe now, I want less of this recipe now, I want, you know, this recipe not to be produced at all. So
that's a fantastic metaphor. I will use that on my future speech. Congrats, Vivienne.
I'm glad to give it to you. So this is a relatively new field. Tell me a bit about your company and why you set it up and what you wanted it to do.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we are a clinical biopharmaceutical company. So we are a pure player biotech in the broad sense of the term. What is distinguishing us is basically we are the European champion on epigenetics. So we have 2 or 3 well-known companies which are public in the US doing also epigenetics. Oryzon is their European counterpart, so to speak. So we develop basically innovative drugs in this field. And we are focused on one of the most fascinating targets, which is LSD1, funny name, but is basically lysine-specific demethylase, which is one of these mechanisms we were talking about before. So this is basically an enzyme which is changing or remodeling the structure of chromatin, and by doing so is, as we said, is able to turn on or turn off a number of different genes. But not only this activity is important, it's also the capability of LSD1 to interact with all the other transcriptional regulators to regulate different key genes in specific critical areas for life, like development or differentiation and so on and so forth. And we know now that LSD1, as other epigenetic targets, is involved in different diseases, in different disorders. So it's basically a very interesting point where we can action on the pathogenesis mechanism by interacting with the LSD1 activity. Okay.
Now, you've chosen to specialize in diseases of the central nervous system and cancer. Why are they particularly appropriate for this epigenetic approach?
Well, epigenetics is not restricted precisely to any specific indication. It's a very broad mechanism, but as a company, because our expertise, our foundations, we were from day one very interested in CNS and also in oncology. So we know that in oncology, LSD1 plays an important role in stemness. And it's also has been described a mechanistic involvement in some subset of cancers, in solid cancers, like a neuroendocrine tumor, but also in leukemia, in hemato-oncology. So we were very interested from day one, and that's why we are right now running well, we were an early mover back in 2009. I think we were probably one of the first companies interrogating this target. And for that reason, right now we are in phase 2. So we are probably the most advanced company with an LSD1 inhibitor in oncology. Same story in CNS. Actually, we all, internally in Oryzon, we start this program because of our discoveries on post-mortem brains, and that lead us to LSD1 at the fundamental role that LSD1 play or may play in different CNS disorders. So we know that LSD1 is involved in neuronal differentiation through development, but also it's very important, LSD1 is basically controlling at the promoter and enhancer region the genes which are important, which are critical for CNS function that we know already. We know nowadays that they are high risk disease genes. Okay.
So you've gone into this field, and there has been some success in the field of epigenetics. There have been epigenetic drugs already developed. So this is not entirely virgin territory. We know that there is efficacy out there.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we could probably distinguish between the epigenetics of the early days when the first ACE-DAC inhibitors were approved. Fortunately, those epigenetic first generation drugs were confined to oncology because their safety profile was hampering them to be developed on other indications which are more demanding in terms of safety balance. So we have seen recently other drugs being approved in cancer, second generation drugs like the semostat, an ACH2 inhibitor, and there are other bromodomain inhibitors being investigated. So yeah, it's a field which is moving forward in a quite consistent manner. And I would say that probably in a few years from now, we will see a full bloom, the same way that we saw 10 years ago, the first initial moves in immuno-oncology, and nowadays we see the full bloom of this area. So we are particularly encouraged by that, and we are particularly encouraged by the fact that we are pioneering also the indications or the capability to move forward in diseases which are beyond oncology, and particularly CNS with our drug, Vivienne. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that now, because you recently announced that you were developing a very exciting new schizophrenia program. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we are really excited. I mean, there is a very strong independent science that has pointed out that there is a strong epigenetic connection in CNS disorders, in neurodegeneration and in psychiatry. Okay, it's only now that we are starting to scratch the surface and to be able to grasp this kind of high mountain to move forward. And to start to think, to be able to think in personalized, in precision medicine. So what we know now is that there is these diseases, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, you name it, borderline personality disorder, whichever. I mean, they are very heterogeneous, and we are only categorizing these diseases because we see that the patients share a number of symptoms. So these are more phenomenological observations. So there is no real molecular mechanism below yet, because we don't have yet this knowledge. However, this situation is changing. So what we have seen in independent research on the last 2-3 years is that there are a number of genetic models of autism or genetic models of schizophrenia, which in different groups have been characterized and molecularly. And we have been able to produce genetic models in animals which recapitulate the symptoms of human patients. And remarkably, on those animals, when these researchers apply LSD1 inhibitors, most of the time our LSD1 inhibitors, what they see is a complete restoration on this critical and complex phenotype of the animals. So for the first time, we are seeing the first smoking guns in terms of the subjacent pathology on those diseases. So what we have announced now,
I was just going to interrupt just one moment, because I think what's remarkable about some of this work is that it's showing that the benefits persist into the adult state, because what we have feared, I guess, with many such conditions, which often arise in late, early adulthood, is that somehow the things are set and that you won't be able to change the course of the disease if you treat in adulthood. But just tell me a bit more about that, because that's very exciting.
No, it is very exciting. Still, we have to take this with a bit of prudence, because I mean, every indication is different. Schizophrenia is a specific disease where the onset is seen on late childhood, on the adolescence. So it is a particularly well suited indication to see if this synaptic plasticity that we all know is there, because we have seen many times people have suffered car accidents or domestic accidents, and after a horrible outcome, they recover and they regain again a number of functionalities. So there is a synaptic plasticity in our brain. We don't know yet how it works. In some diseases like schizophrenia, which is starting quite late on the development, on the young development of humans, what these experiments are telling us is that what we could expect, it would be expectable, I would say, that we could have a sort of recovery on those patients. That might be different on diseases where you have an earlier onset. So in autism or in diseases where these problems are earlier. But still, this has been a key question for CNS biology for many, many years. To what extent our brain is able to adapt and to be plastic, and if the situation, the molecular dysfunction is solved in our brain, to what extent we would be able to improve or even to restore some of these disorders. It's a fascinating area indeed. And that's something that we are going to do in collaboration with the Columbia University, with Columbia Psychiatric, by studying the Amish founder population in the state of Pennsylvania, where there are a number of families that they have the homozygous, the heterozygous, and close relatives, which are basically unaffected. And we will be able to compare all those and to see what are the differences, to set the basis, the foundations for a clinical trial that we plan to do at the end of this first stage.
So that's exciting work to come. But tell me now a bit more about the ALICE trial that you've been involved in and the data that's come out of that.
Well, ALICE is indeed a trial which is producing really thrilling data. I mean, we are really struck by the strong data that we are getting. ALICE is a phase 2 we do in combination with azacitidine in the elderly unfit or unfit AML population. So it's
AML, acute myeloid leukemia.
Yes, acute myeloid leukemia. Thank you very much. And what we have seen is levels of responses which are on the 80% of the observable patients, of the evaluable patients. Responses which are very fast. They occur mostly after cycle 1, and some of them are really remarkably long. So we see as the trial progresses, we see that we get a progressive maturation in the duration of responses, with a number of patients already for more than 1 year in response. So one patient already in 2 years. So it's really exciting. And I think that this is basically a molecule that we want to develop not only in the hemato-oncology, in leukemia, but also in solid tumors, and particularly in neuroendocrine tumors, where LSD1 plays a critical role on the pathogenesis of these diseases. Yes.
So what sort of data do we need now from ALICE for this new approach to be a successful product?
Well, I mean, we are still enrolling. It's our aim to arrive to the 36 patients. So we are still on the 20s, on the lower 20s. So we still need to recruit more patients and to see that this duration of response mature on the way I was explaining for a majority of those patients. We know that with the recent approval of the FDA of a BCL2 inhibitor, venetoclax, this has become the new standard of care. But still, I think that all hematologists would agree with me on that there is still an unmet medical need, because there are people who are refractory to those drugs. Most of the people relapse sooner or later. We shouldn't forget that these approved drugs, they are not curative. So what we believe is that iadademstat can play a role in leukemia, either as a complement on the first line, as a resource for the physicians for second line, for relapsed people, or probably also as well in combination with venetoclax. So we think that we are setting the foundations for developing this drug in hemato-oncology. And this is what we are going to do, and we will provide more guidance in the second half of this year. And also in terms of solid tumors, as I said, we have done already 2 trials in small cell lung cancer. We know it's safe, it's well tolerated in monotherapy, and we have seen also interesting anecdotal efficacy responses. So we are also working on a continuation on this trial that we will also inform. We will also give some guidance by the second half of this year. It is coming year.
So what are the milestones that investors should be looking out for over the next 6 to 12 months? And we should say that in these extraordinary times, anything can happen.
Yes, indeed. Interesting times, as you said. We basically are starting 2 phase 2Bs in CNS. The first one is Portico. Portico is a phase 2B in borderline personality disorder. We were already mentioning the strengths of this idea of personalized medicine in epigenetics in CNS with LSD1. But what we have seen is that in a previous phase 1 basket trial study in aggression agitation in several psychiatric conditions, we saw a very strong reduction of aggression measured by different scales, and also an improvement on the overall status of the patients. So what we have launched, and we got the CTA already in Spain. We expect to get the IND in the US on the first quarter. This is going to be a multinational study to be run in the US, in Spain, and in several other European countries in borderline personality disorder, double-blind, placebo-controlled, 14 weeks. So we expect to have an accrual time of 18-24 months. So during this year, we will inform the market how this phase 2B is being deployed. Something similar in schizophrenia, where we are starting a clinical trial all in patients, not genetically selected, but also to look for cognitive impairment and negative symptoms. This is going to be also multicentric, double-blind, placebo-controlled. Both of them are going to be quite large in terms of dimension. We expect to recruit around 160 patients in borderline personality disorders, and between 80 to 100 patients in the schizophrenia one. So these are 2 important hallmarks. We expect to have the first readouts on these preliminary studies in personalized medicine in psychiatry with Columbia in the third quarter next year. That would set up the foundation, as I said, for a genetically selected study. And in oncology, of course, we are going to present more data in EHA at the European Hematological Association conference in June, in ASH in December. And as I said, we provide further guidance on the new clinical trials that we want to launch on the second half of this year. So it's going to be a really intense year for Oryzon. We really are very excited. So it is true that the world out there is kind of strange. So it's like we are seeing science fiction movies, but we are basically working in a very consistent manner, very streamlined. And I think that we will be able to deliver good news to the community and to the investors during the whole year.
And I'm right in saying, I think, that whilst there are many, many drugs in oncology, actually the range of potential medications within psychiatric disorders is really much, much more limited. And there hasn't been that much good news over the last, I guess, couple of decades.
Very much so. I agree. Is particularly in the psychiatry field is a kind of open label world of the label world. Sorry, where psychiatrists are basically trying to improve the life of their patients with drugs which are not approved for this indication. They are doing basically a very empirical individual approach. So what we have seen in borderline personality disorder, particularly in this indication, there is no any drug approved for this indication. Patients are being treated for their symptoms with antipsychotics, where they are having really strong secondary side effects. So yeah, it is really, and same thing for neurodegeneration. So it is in CNS is really a field where we need to set up a new pharmacology more based on the mechanism and more based on selecting patients which can really benefit from those drugs. Yes.
And the one thing, of course, we do know about lots of psychiatric disorders, we talked about, this idea of post-it notes being stuck on your genome, your recipe book. But we know that life events, particularly, are often things that prompt the appearance of psychiatric disorders that actually may have been there all along. So they do seem an ideal target for this kind of approach.
They are, because as you very rightly said, I mean, psychiatric conditions are very often the juxtaposition of a genetic background plus a sort of environmental stress or a catastrophic event that happens to the individuals, and then people start to develop the disease, and these epigenetic mechanisms can really modulate these new onsets. No, so this is very right. So yeah.
Some questions from investors here. First of all, what's your partnership strategy? Are you looking to sell your products yourselves, or are you going to go through partners?
Well, we are always very transparent and candid on this. When you think in terms of big indications, and I think that everybody realize that it's difficult for a company and a small company to really be not for financial terms that eventually you could get the funding for that, but to be really efficient on reaching the market. The market access is something that requires a lot of know-how, not only money. So I think that when we are talking on big indications, I think that our approach is quite pragmatic, and we look in sometime in the future to find the right partner, to leverage on the right partners. Although we can contemplate to conservate, to preserve some rights or some. But when it goes to small indications which might be niche, where you have a community of patients and community of families of patients, which are very committed and very active, I think that is much more invisible for a company like us to go all the way through. So this is something that we like to play with this idea, and as we will see how this develops, if we can get a real horizon on that, we will be very open to commercialize on ourselves on these specific niche markets. Yes.
Another $64,000 question here. When do you think you'll reach the market, and how long before you're profitable?
Wow, this is a $1 million question. No? So no, we don't provide guidance yet. As I was explaining, our clinical development in this moment is following a kind of dual approach. So a canonical approach, I mean, setting the phase 2Bs in large indications, which will require phase 3s and so on. So that will probably leverage on some partnerships sometime down the road. On the other hand, we are exploring very aggressively this personalized medicine approach, where you could envisage one could envisage that Oryzon could get an expedite approval. Should that be the case, so then we would provide more guidance when we see a more open scenario. But for the moment, we need to be prudent as a public company that we are.
And how much cash runway do you have? What's your plan for funding for the company?
Yeah, well, we were, that was very fortunate, because I would say, one of the worst moments of the pandemic, in May, June, we were able to set up a new funding for the company. So we raised, with the help of 3 European banks, 20 million euros. So we expect to have cash runway till the beginning of 2023. So we are not in a special urgent situation. But of course, as we always say, we want to have a financing horizon on the long term. So for the next 2 years, I think that we are well served, but we will be very open to see how the market evolves and how we can strengthen the balance sheet of the company in the future. But we are not going to do anything in the near term future for the moment. Yeah.
Well, congratulations for having set up that funding, because you're based in Madrid, aren't you? And Madrid was the worst affected city in Spain at that particular time. So hats off to you for having pulled that off. Just finally, this has been a fascinating conversation. This is such a rich new area for discovery. Where do you see yourself going in the next, say, 3 to 5 years? Still concentrating on these CNS, which are diseases which are so badly served at the moment, doing more cancer, or what's the plan?
That's also a $1 million question. It is true that for a company of our size, and we have been questioned about that, to what extent we can competitively explore two different assets which are in phase 2 and which are in 2 different conditions, like CNS and oncology. And it's true, it's demanding, it's costing us an extra effort. On the other hand, I would also like to know that we are concentrated on the same target. So we have a know-how around the biology of the target, which is really cross-fertilizing both programs. And what we learn from one program, we have also a certain degree of translationability to the other program. So in that sense, there are internal synergies. And as I said, we are open to partnership scenarios. So we will see how this evolves. But yeah, we still see ourselves developing the 2 main areas of activity of the company in 3 years from now, and hopefully by that time, with a much more clear view on how we could get the first drug approved.
Carlos Buesa, it's been a joy talking to you. This is such a fascinating area of science. My science girl enthusiasm is racing away because it's such a fascinating area of discovery. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much, Vivienne, for your time today. Thank you very much.